All right, well, good morning, everyone. Thank you, Brandon and Air, for leading us. I always enjoy worshiping the Lord through singing. Every Sunday morning, the Lord always touches my heart through the songs. We all come on a Sunday morning in different circumstances. Maybe some of us have had some long weeks. Maybe it's been tough at work. Maybe you've had a sick child. Maybe you're worried about a family member, or whatever the case. We all have different things that we are currently going through. We're at different stages of life. We have different things that are on our hearts and on our minds. Even when we come and we gather and we sit together, and I just love how the songs that we sing on a Sunday morning just point us to the right direction, to remind us, of how great His love is for us, to remind us, to not be overwhelmed, to remind us that we will love God. He is our rock. He is our shield, and just these songs just pointing us to where we need to be, setting our hearts in the right place. So thank you guys for leading and for ministering to me. I needed to be reminded of those words and those truths. When we sing songs, it's not about the melody, it's not about how it sounds, it's about the truths that we're singing, the truths about God. And I pray that God would minister to you in the way that He ministers to me each week. All right, good morning. Good to be with you. You noticed our set looks a little bit different today, all right? And so it looks a little more lively and a little more bubbly a little bit, all right? It's because this week we are having our child dedication service, and so we're going to have our babies with us, and we are going to some families are going to make commitments. The church, we're going to call upon you to make a commitment to raise our children in the ways of the Lord. Pastor Chris is going to come and oversee that part of our service later today. And so our message is going to be a little bit shorter today so that we can make room for that portion of our service. As a pastor, I'm excited that we as a church prioritize strong biblical families, that we as a church prioritize raising up our children, partnering with families to raise your children. As a parent, I am honored to, that God would call me to raise my children in the ways of the Lord. I think about my own upbringing, and one of my favorite memories as a kid is sitting down with my mom, sitting down with my dad, sitting on their lap, and the stories that my parents would tell me. And my mom and dad love to tell stories, and they told all kinds of stories. I was born in Laos, and my parents obviously were born in Laos, grew up in Laos, so that's my heritage, that's my roots. But I grew up in America, and so since I was 4 years old, our family moved to America, and so all that I knew about Laos and about life and culture in Laos was from the stories that my parents, would tell us. And so we would ask all kinds of questions, and my mom would talk about her childhood, how, what she did growing up as a kid was digging for beetles, and finding beetles and then making them pets. I was like, wow, that's not what we did growing up. And so she would tell stories about how she met my dad, and tell stories about working in the rice field. I remember my mom, whenever we would eat, and I grew up on sticky rice, right? So we would eat some kamniel, and my mom would always take a grain of rice, and she said, son, do you know how hard it is just to get this one grain of rice, and then, so before we ate, she wanted us to appreciate every grain of rice, and she would tell the stories of her bending over and planting the rice and all of that. Now, some of the stories were pretty lighthearted. She told me the story of how I got my nickname, Thai, right? So if you know Thai or Lao, Thai is, it means rabbit. And so all of us, we have our names that are given names. So my actual given name is Sang Tien, which means candlelight. And then my nickname is usually, in Lao culture, the nicknames are usually some kind of animal or something silly like that, right? And so I said, well, why did you name me Thai? And so she would say, well, as soon as you started crawling, you were just really fast, and you crawled everywhere, and so we started calling you Rabbit. We started calling you Thai, right? And so I said, well, why'd you name my brother my brother Tu, which means toad, right? So, well, because he was fat, and he was a fat and slow baby, and he knows that. We make fun of him about that. Now, some stories that my parents told just were so interesting to me as a kid. So my dad, for example, he used to flex his bicep to me all the time when I was a little kid, and he would point at his bicep, and there was this little bump on his bicep. And so when I was growing up, I was like, wow, my dad's so strong, he's got muscles on muscles, right? And then later I found out that little bump was a bullet. And so I would say, Dad, what is that on your arm? And he would say, well, come here, son, come feel it. And I would feel this little bump on his arm, and he would tell this story about when he was a soldier fighting in the Civil War in Laos back in the 50s and 60s, and how he got shot and wounded, and it didn't go through, and so the bullet stayed in his arm, and they never took it out. And he kept it in there because he believed at the time that it was sort of like a lucky charm. Because before the soldiers would go into battle, they would have some kind of amulet, and they would take it to be blessed by a monk, and they were told and they believed that wearing this amulet would protect them from bullets, right? And so when my dad got shot and he didn't die, and this bullet was in his arm, he was like, oh, this must mean that this is a special bullet, right? And so it's still in his arm to this day, right? Now, he doesn't believe those same things now, because he's a follower of Christ now, but that was just so interesting to me growing up. And feeling this little bullet in his arm. Now with Kai, I just say, feel this bicep, son. No bullet there, but I'm not as tough as Grandpa. And many of the stories, though, that my parents told were often tragic. My father, after the war, was taken as a political prisoner, and he was taken into a re-education camp in the jungles of Laos. He was there for about 7 years. We heard stories about how during that time my family was pretty much homeless, and my mom, with 10 kids in tow, would have to go into the village and ask people to take us in, and how we didn't have land on our own, and so there was a family that said, hey, here we've got this little bit of land, you can try to harvest rice on there, and that's how my family was able to survive and not starve. Just all these different stories. I had 3 older siblings that passed away because of diseases, and we didn't have access to basic health care. The stories of how we ultimately escaped Laos by paying a fisherman to smuggle us across the Mekong River, how we were searching for a better future. And a lot of these stories, as we heard them as kids, and my parents would tell us these stories, they would sort of wrap it up with a life lesson. And it went pretty much something like this. They would look back at these stories and they'd say, son, we didn't know God at the time, but God knew us, and he loved us, and he cared for us, and he has a plan for our lives. And so that was all these stories that my parents were telling me when I was growing up. They wanted us to know that truth, that through all the tragedy, through all the things we went through, God was with us, and he took care of us, and he has a great plan for us. And I'm so grateful that my parents told me stories as a kid. I'm grateful that my parents sat me down and told these stories. Some were funny, some were sad, some were just plain interesting, some were scary. I could tell you more of those stories later. But just so grateful for those stories. And in today's message, in Joshua chapter 4, we're going to see God commanding his people to tell stories to their children. We're going to see God commanding his people to tell stories to their children. Stories that point to God's might. Stories that point to God's miracle that points to God's mercy in their lives. And so please turn with me to Joshua chapter 4. Joshua chapter 4. You know, we're in this series called Strength and Courage, and we've been studying the book of Joshua, which recounts the story of the journey of God's people as they leave the wilderness after wandering for 40 years, and they finally enter into the promised land. And last week we looked at chapter 3, which told the first part of the miraculous crossing of the Jordan River. Chapter 4 is sort of like part 2 of this story, okay? So 3 and 4, you often, you read it together because, again, it's 2 parts of the same story here. And so in chapter 4, what we're going to see is God is going to tell Joshua to command the people to set up a memorial, to remember the miraculous event of the crossing of the Jordan. So we're going to look at verses 1 through 7, and then we're going to skip to 19 through 24 just for time's sake. And so we're going to look at God's command to tell his people to remember, to set up this memorial. So look with me in Joshua 4, verses 1 through 7. When all the nation had finished passing over the Jordan, the Lord said to Joshua, "Take 12 men from the people, from each tribe a man, and command them, saying, 'Take 12 stones from here, out of the midst of the Jordan, from the very place where the priest's feet stood firmly, and bring them over with you, and lay them down in the place where you lodge tonight.' Then Joshua called the 12 men from the people of Israel, whom he appointed, a man from each tribe. And Joshua said to them, 'Pass on before the ark of the Lord, your God, into the midst of the Jordan, and take up each of you a stone upon his shoulder, according to the number of the tribes of the people of Israel, that this may be a sign among you. And when your children ask in time to come, what do these stones mean? Then you shall tell them that the waters of the Jordan were cut off before the ark of the covenant of the Lord. When it passed over the Jordan, the waters of the Jordan were cut off. So these stones shall be to the people of Israel a memorial forever.'" All right, jump with me to verse 19. "The people came up out of the Jordan on the 10th day of the first month, and they encamped at Gilgal on the east border of Jericho. And those 12 stones which they took out of the Jordan, Joshua set up at Gilgal. And he said to the people of Israel, 'When your children ask their fathers in times to come, what do these stones mean? Then you shall let your children know, Israel passed over this Jordan on dry ground. For the Lord your God dried up the waters of the Jordan for you until you passed over, as the Lord your God did to the Red Sea, which he dried up for us until we passed over, so that all the peoples of the earth may know that the hand of God, the hand of the Lord is mighty, that you may fear the Lord your God forever.'" Okay? And so, again, in chapter 4 here, we see this command. They've just, they're in the process of crossing the river. It's a miraculous event, right? We talked about this last week. And now we see the command to select 12 people, one from each tribe, to go back into the river, into the riverbed. Remember, it is dry now. And so it would have, the rocks on the riverbed would have been exposed. They were to go back and they were to dig up a stone, to represent each tribe. And they were to take it out of there, put it on their shoulders, and carry it across the river and set it up right there where they were on the banks. We see later in the story, as they move to a different place, they take it with them and they set it up at Gilgal, okay? So we're not talking about pebbles, okay? It says that they put it on their shoulder, all right? So this was more like boulders, okay? Like small boulders. They would go and they would dig it up and they would take it and they would carry it. And so what we see that as soon as they did that. They came out, and then the priest came out, and everybody came out. As soon as the priest, their feet left the riverbed, the water started flowing again. We see that in the rest of chapter 4 that we skipped over. The water started flowing again. So just as their feet touched the water and then the water was cut off, now they're on the other side. They leave the river. Their feet leave the riverbed, and the waters start flowing again. And so the main event here in this story is the setting up of the stones, which God said will be a sign, a memorial, okay? A sign points to something. A memorial helps you to remember something, right? And this something that they were to be pointed to, this something that they were to remember is the miracle at the Jordan, is God's mercy, is God's might, God's miraculous work here. Now, you might read this and you think, maybe that sounds kind of strange to you. We're kind of far removed from this culture. But the truth is, it's not unusual in the Old Testament for God's people to set up memorials. When you read all these stories, Jacob, for example, he goes and he's traveling and he has his dream. Remember the dream about Jacob's ladder and all that? He has his dream where he's wrestling with God and God gives him the new name Israel. Well, what does he do when he gets up? He takes that stone that he used as a pillow and he set up an altar there. He set up a memorial. We see another instance where Samuel, after the Lord helped them in a battle, set up a stone, and it's called the Ebenezer stone, right? If you know some of the old hymns, you hear this song about, here I raise my Ebenezer, right? The Ebenezer stone, that word literally means my rock of help, right? Because God came to help. And so we see this as a practice, not only in Hebrew culture, but in all of the ancient cultures. They did this. They would set up stones and they would stack stones to commemorate an event or an act of God. And in fact, if you really take a close look at Jewish life and practice, so much of what they did was about remembering God's past faithfulness. The Passover. Continue to observe the Passover meal. Why? So that when your children ask, why do we do this? You can tell them of how the Lord delivered us out of Egypt, right? And so all of their feasts and their holidays and so much of their religious life was about remembering God's faithfulness. Why such an emphasis on remembering what God has done? Well, the reason is people are forgetful. We are forgetful. We forget things easily. We often forget what God has done for us. Even in this morning, as I'm sitting here, listening and singing this worship song, and I'm thinking about my week, and, maybe it's a little bit harder than most weeks, and then, I see these lyrics that say, how great is God's love for us? And I was like, thank you, God. I needed to remember that. Because so often I just focus on what I'm going through right now, and I forget these truths. And so often I forget how God has been faithful to me already in so many ways in the past. When I just focus on what's in front of me, I sometimes forget. And I forget how God has delivered me from some things. I forget how God's been faithful in just the right moment, in just the right time. I forget that. And so the Israelites were no different. We are a people that are forgetful. Okay? And it's one thing to be forgetful, like, I forgot my keys, and I forgot this, I forgot that. That's little things, right? But let us not forget what God has done. Let us not forget God's faithfulness to us. We often need reminders of God's mercy, reminders of God's might, reminders of God's faithfulness. Because remembering God's past faithfulness helps us to build present faithfulness in us. Remembering God's faithfulness to us in the past helps to build faithfulness in us to God in the present. Okay? And so Joshua 4 teaches us an important spiritual truth. And so this morning we've got 1 point, all right? So not all sermons don't have to have 3 points, okay? We got 1 point today, and that is this. This is a spiritual truth that we learned today, and that is that we should build memorials in our lives that point our children to God. Build memorials that point our children to God. So what does this mean for us today? Does this mean we go out to a riverbed and try to pick up a boulder and start stacking rocks? Does it mean that we build physical structures or altars? Not necessarily, okay? There's nothing wrong with having something physical to remind you of something spiritual or some milestone, right? I think as a culture, as a society, we build memorials all the time, okay? We have statues that commemorate some great person, maybe founder of a country or things like that, right? We have, plaques and statues that commemorate some great event in history. Okay, and so I think it's just something that we do as a people, and in your own life, you might have something physical that you use as a reminder of something in your life, but I don't think it necessarily has to mean something physical. When I say we should build memorials that point our children to God, I believe that one way we can do that is by telling stories. It's by telling stories. And really, this event in Joshua 4 was never about the stones. It was about the stories. It was never about the stones. It was about the stories. Take these stones and stack them up. Why? So that when your children ask you one day, when children ask their father, what do these stones mean? Then tell them the story. So it was always about the story. The stones didn't have any magical powers. It was about the story that the stones, to which the stones pointed. This tells us a couple of things. Okay, one of the things that this tells us is that the primary responsibility of passing along the stories of God to the next generation, the primary responsibility of teaching the things of God to the next generation belong primarily to parents. It belongs primarily to parents. We see this, and I know Pastor Chris is going to probably talk about this a little bit more later in the in our service, but you see it throughout Scripture. Teach your children. Pass this along to your children, right? Who is supposed to be the primary person to share and shape, our kids in terms of teaching them about God? It rests on the shoulders of parents. And at Life Point Church, I want you to know this. I believe we have a wonderful children's ministry here. We've got all kinds of things in there that help to facilitate that. But I want you to know that how we view children ministry at our church is that we want to partner with you. Okay, we want to partner with you to help you raise your children to know, to love, and to serve the Lord. We're not trying to replace that role. Okay, but we want to come alongside you, give you tools, resources, and do what we can to help you raise your children in the ways of the Lord, because we believe that the primary responsibility rests with the parents. So yes, when your children come to church, we will love them. We will teach them the Bible, but do not neglect this in your home. Do not neglect Bible reading with your children at home. Do not neglect telling the stories in your home. Teach and model in your families and in your home what it means to know, to love, and to serve God. And one way that we can do that is by telling stories that point to God. Just as the Israelites were told when the children asked, what do these stones mean? And they were told to tell them what happened here at the Jordan. In the same way, when our kids ask us questions about things in life, or why things have happened or events that have happened, we have an opportunity to point them to the goodness of God, to point them to the mercy of God, to the faithfulness of God. It could be something as simple as, Mom, Dad, why are we going to church again? Right? Any parent ever get that question? Why do we go to church every week, right? We could say, well, hey, because I say so, right? or well, this is just what we do. We could say that, or we could point to God. We could say, hey, honey, son, we go to church because we want to worship God with others. We worship God because He saves us. Even though we are sinners, God loves us, and He wants to be. He wants us to be with Him forever. And we could even share our story of that point, that time in our life when we gave our life to Christ. So, looking for opportunities, taking opportunities to answer questions and to point them to God. I believe that one day, our kids, as they grow up, they're going to read in the history books about the COVID-19 pandemic, right? And they're going to ask, what was that like? What was it like to go through the pandemic? And we could talk about all the restrictions and the lockdowns and the borders closing, the economy, and gas went up. And we can talk about all these things. And we had to wear masks, and kids had, all this stuff. We can talk about that. And that's fine. We can give them information. But we can also tell them stories of God's protection. We can tell them stories of God's faithfulness. We can tell them stories of how God continued to provide for our family throughout this time. We can tell them stories of how God was present and near to us even when we lost a friend or a loved one to COVID. What kind of stories are we going to tell to our children? And are they going to point to the mercy, to the power, and to the faithfulness of God? There are many of you, here that you're living here in Thailand, but you weren't born here. And one day your kids may ask, "How did we end up in Thailand? Why did we spend so many years in Thailand?" And again, you can tell them stories about why you moved. There was a job change, job opportunity, You can tell those things. That's fine. But we could also tell them stories of God's call on our lives to come to Thailand, to make the gospel known to all nations. We could tell stories of how God provided a job so that we could be here. We could tell stories of the relationships and the connections that were made possible only by God. We can tell stories of God's protection for some families here. We could tell stories of God's protection when we fled our country to seek safety here in Thailand. What stories are we going to tell? Are we going to tell stories that point our children to the mercy and to the love of God and to the faithfulness of God? I'll wrap it up here with verse 23 and 24. In these two verses here, we are reminded of the purpose, the ultimate purpose in telling our children the stories of God. Look with me in verse 23. For the Lord your God dried up the waters of the Jordan for you until you passed over, as the Lord your God did to the Red Sea, which He dried up for us until we passed over. So that, these last two sentences, why? So that all the peoples of the earth may know that the hand of the Lord is mighty, that you may fear the Lord your God forever. Joshua told them the purpose in telling the story of God's might and God's power. It wasn't just so that they could talk about, man, how cool it was that the water stopped. Have you ever seen a river stop flowing? It wasn't so that, ultimately, it wasn't about how cool it was that this wall of water was being built up and 2 million people crossed over and the ground was dry even though it was flood season. Ultimately, it was about the glory of God. One of the reasons on why God did this miracle and how telling this story, what the purpose of telling the story is this: so that you may fear the Lord your God forever. We tell these stories hoping and pointing our children to fear the Lord, to worship God. Isn't that what we want as parents? Right? We want our children to grow up in the fear of the Lord. Now look, in this context, we all know that doesn't mean being frightened, being scared of God, right? It means, having the right understanding of God's authority and God's role in our life, right? So we want to raise our children, and we tell these stories so that our children can fear God, that our children can love God, and that our children can worship God. Isn't that what we want? For them to be devoted to God. That's our prayer for our children, right? We have a lot of different desires for our children, right? We want the best for our kids. We want our kids to have the best opportunities and have good education and pursue their passions and be productive citizens of community and have a good job and be happy and live a good life. But more than anything, we want our children to fear the Lord. More than anything, we want our children to grow up, to know the Lord, to love the Lord. Amen? And so, again, we can put them in the best schools with the best programs, and we can provide the best priorities, but the number one priority for Christian parents is to raise our children in the fear of the Lord. The other reason why God stopped up the Jordan, the other reason why the Israelites were told to tell the story is so that all the peoples of the earth may know that the hand of the Lord is mighty, right? God desires to be worshipped by all peoples of the earth. He alone deserves to be worshipped. And when we tell stories to our children, we point out that we want them to worship God and to fear Him, but we also remind them of God's mission, that He wants to be worshipped among all peoples. And so this is the reminder that I want to share with you from Joshua 4 this morning as we take the responsibility of raising our kids, being parents. Let us tell stories. Let us build memorials in our life. Let us point everything to the person of God, the mercy of God, the goodness of God. Let us take these opportunities. So what does that look like for you in your life? What does that look like? What memorials do you have in your life that point your children to God? And we hope that this becomes an opportunity for us to instill in them not only the fear of God and the worship of God, but a passion for the glory of God among all peoples in the earth. At this time, we're going to have Pastor Chris, and he's going to come, and we're going to segue into our child dedication segment this morning. So, Chris, why don't you come and you lead us in that?